So most of us, if not all of us, have found it difficult to think clearly in stressful situations, or we find that creative ideas seem harder to come by when we're feeling overwhelmed. This is not just in our heads, it's how our brain responds to stress. So today we're going to explore the typically known fight or flight, though also freeze and fawn responses, how they affect critical brain functions like creativity, memory and decision making, and how to restore calm and clarity using proven strategies. When we encounter perceived threat, and perceived is the word to focus on here because for many the brain may perceive threat in a realistically non-threatening situation, and this is usually based on traumatic past experiences whereby the brain has associated a particular sense, type of person, place, situation, object, etc. with danger. So whether it's a real threat or a perceived threat, most likely in many situations, our brain activates the sympathetic nervous system, and this triggers what's known as the fight, flight, freeze or fawn response. And your brain will activate one of these responses based on past experiences of stress, how much stress the body and brain have been under at the time, as well as our individual levels of resilience and, of course, current levels and impact of individuals' brain dysregulation, which is usually caused by things like prolonged trauma, PTSD, ADHD, autism, etc. So this ancient stress survival mechanism is controlled by the amygdala, the part of the brain that's responsible for detecting danger. But in doing so, the amygdala suppresses the activity of the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain at the front of the brain here, and that's responsible for executive function, creativity, decision-making, planning, etc. When a threat is detected, the brain's amygdala triggers the release of stress hormones, and these are primarily adrenaline and cortisol. So adrenaline heightens alertness and prepares the brain for rapid instinctual responses, so usually they're automatic. However, it also suppresses the prefrontal cortex, which reduces the brain's capacity for rational thought and creativity. And cortisol sustains the stress response, so it further impairs the prefrontal cortex. And this affects executive functions like problem solving, memory retrieval, and of course, again, creative thinking. Heart rate and blood pressure increase to supply muscles with more oxygen so we can move. Breathing quickens to increase oxygen intake, so when you have a panic attack, that sort of breath quickens, and also digestive system and immunity gets suppressed to conserve energy. And this redirection of resources, it ensures survival, but it also stops the brain from higher order thinking. And when the prefrontal cortex is suppressed, there's several key functions that are impaired. So I've mentioned some of them: executive functions, so planning, problem solving, and rational decision making. They all become very rigid and reactive. Memory retention and retrieval, the hippocampus struggles under stress, so it makes it harder to remember or recall information. Creativity, as I've said before, creative thinking, problem solving relies on divergent processes, which are shut down when the brain defaults into this habitual survival-based thinking. Attention and focus. The brain becomes hyper-focused on perceived threat, making it difficult to concentrate on unrelated tasks, and also we can become very sort of hyper-fixated on things as well. The good news is that we can counteract this response by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS, which is often called the rest and digest system, because it basically, when it's activated, it helps to calm the body. It re-engages the prefrontal cortex, restoring this sort of rational thinking and focus and creativity. It also restores the digestive system and your immunity. So here are practical strategies to trigger the PNS so we can restore that cognitive clarity. So somatic strategies, we've all heard of them before, but a lot of us still don't practice them. Breathwork, slow, deep breathing into the diaphragm, like inhaling for 5 breaths, breathing out for 5 or 7. And this is the natural rate of breathing, which is 6 breaths a minute. And there's evidence that shows that this is our natural evolutionary rate of breath, and we've just lost it. And there's a lot of study around how present day quick breathing is reducing CO2 retention, and this has profound effects on our bodies, but that's for another video. And I'll also link a great podcast about that. So breathing slowly can reduce cortisol and activate the PNS, and this is a biological fact. Body scanning, focusing our attention on different parts of the body, noticing sensations and releasing tension. Remember, our muscles talk to our brain. So if we're holding tension, the muscles signal that there is something to be tense about, i.e. a threat. So the brain signals this and then pumps out more stress hormones in response to that threat, keeping the sympathetic nervous system activated. Cognitive strategies, so cognitive reframing, actively challenging negative thoughts by reframing them into more balanced perspectives. A must for people who perceive threat in many things due to trauma or past environmental stressors. Thought stopping, so interrupting intrusive negative thinking by saying stop, or imagining a big red stop sign when the thought starts to run. This is a lifesaver. Again, if your thoughts are consistently offering up negative ideas and opinions, either generally or regarding a certain person or a place, thing, then your brain is going to be primed for threat detection, thus keeping this stress response cycle active throughout each day. Thought diffusion is a great one, observing thoughts without attaching meaning to them. So visualize them sort of just like floating away like clouds or leaves on a stream. And this is fantastic for training your brain to not emotionally connect to every thought that we have. Think of this, if your mind is primed for detecting threats, and so you perceive threat in every interaction, and when that interaction passes in the real life, you begin to relive it over and over and over in your mind, and you emotionally connect to that story you're telling yourself. So what do you think the brain believes? It believes that you're still in that interaction in real life. Remember, to the brain, imaginary rehearsal is the same as real exposure. If you imagine an argument in your mind, this will trigger the same emotional responses as if you were having it in, like, for real. And now imagining a past experience of being attacked or abused. You're reliving the moment in your mind, and the brain doesn't know the difference. So what state of mind and body do you think you'll be in if you relive that trauma over and over in your mind? So that's why practicing not to emotionally detach to your thoughts and reframing irrational fear-induced thoughts are life-saving skills, and I mean that literally. Behavioural strategies. So taking breaks, stepping away from stressful situations helps to reduce that stress response. If you're hyper-focusing, if you've got ADHD, learning to step away, it's hard, but try and do it. Focusing on the present moment and using your senses, identifying what you see and hear and touch keeps you grounded, keeps your brain away from that stress. And then physical activity, obviously, it does boost mood, it does lower cortisol, so your exercise. And replacing habits as well, unhealthy habits with more healthier alternatives. So being mindful of our coping habits is very crucial, because if we keep pushing down and avoiding our stresses, they will just keep building in our minds and our body. No stimulant can remove the uncomfortable feeling of unease indefinitely. These habits are designed to suppress, not cure. It's important to note here that these techniques are used to switch on the parasympathetic nervous system functions when we are unnecessarily launched into an automatic threat, or with response to habits, an automatic coping response in non-threatening situations. It's essential that we continue to rewire our responses to irrational fears in the moment, learning to approach perceived threats with a more rational state of mind, so that eventually the brain will learn that there is no threat. It's therefore important to recognise when our stress response has been triggered, calm ourselves, then bring in some rationalisation using mentioned methods like CBT, thought challenge reframing to bring rational thinking, the prefrontal cortex, back online and back in charge. This is essentially training the brain to rewire its response. This is not about avoiding the trigger through relaxation, then allowing yourself to be triggered by the same thing the very next day. We have to do the work past the parasympathetic activation to rewire our perception of that threat through analytical and rational cognitive reframing. And this means consistent practice as well, so we can form more helpful habits of thinking, feeling and behaving. And you never know, once that automatic stress response isn't activated as much, you may not need those unhelpful coping habits as well. Your mind is powerful, and with the right tools, you can keep it working at its best, even under stress.